What if the reason you have felt stuck is not because your energy is too low, but because you have been trying to rise while still holding yourself down? For so long, people have been taught to believe that healing, manifestation, and transformation require them to become something higher, brighter, better, more spiritual, more positive. They are told to raise their vibration, fix their frequency, think better thoughts, and force themselves into a state that feels more aligned. But what if that entire frame is backwards? What if your deepest problem has never been the absence of love, peace, joy, or openness, but the pressure you have been placing on yourself to manufacture what is already naturally within you? Imagine a cork floating in the ocean. It does not struggle to rise. It does not rehearse affirmations to deserve the surface. It does not force itself upward through effort. It floats because floating is its nature. It sinks only when something pushes it down. In the same way, your natural state may not be something you need to create. It may be something that has always been there beneath the pressure, beneath the fear, beneath the survival patterns, beneath the emotional weight you learned to carry. And that changes everything, because now the question is no longer, how do I become high vibration? The real question becomes, what is pressing down on my natural openness right now? What resistance, what fear, what old pain, what unprocessed emotion has been mistaken for your identity? And if what you truly are has never disappeared, only been buried, then what might happen when you finally stop trying to become and begin to release? What if the moment you stop trying to elevate yourself is the exact moment your energy begins to rise on its own? There is a quiet misunderstanding hidden inside the idea of raising your vibration. It suggests that you are currently below where you should be, that something about you is lacking, and that through effort, discipline, or control, you can climb into a better state. But this creates a subtle tension inside your system, a constant pressure to perform, to improve, to escape what you are feeling right now. And pressure does not create openness. It creates contraction. Think about how often you have tried to fix your state. You notice discomfort, anxiety, sadness, or emotional heaviness, and immediately there is a reaction. Change it, shift it, override it. You reach for better thoughts, distractions, affirmations, or strategies, not because they arise naturally, but because you believe you shouldn't feel what you are feeling. But what if that very reaction is the force pushing the cork under the water? In quantum terms, your state is not something you impose. It is something that emerges from coherence. When your thoughts, emotions, and nervous system are in conflict, you create internal resistance. And resistance distorts your field more than any negative emotion ever could. So instead of asking, "How do I feel better?" a more powerful question begins to open. What am I not allowing myself to feel right now? Because the moment you stop resisting your internal experience, something shifts. The tightness softens. The urgency dissolves. The need to control begins to loosen. And beneath that there is space. And within that space, something unexpected starts to rise. Not because you forced it, but because you finally stopped holding it down. If this perspective is already shifting something inside you, make sure to subscribe and like the video, because what comes next may change how you see yourself completely. Have you ever noticed how the more you try to control a feeling, the stronger it seems to become? This is where everything begins to reveal a deeper truth. What we often call low vibration is not actually something wrong with you. It is not a failure. It is not a sign that you are out of alignment in some moral or spiritual sense. It is simply contraction, a natural response of your nervous system trying to create safety. And what we call high vibration is not something you achieve. It is openness. That's it. Not a hierarchy. Not a level. not something reserved for the awakened or the disciplined. Just a state where your energy is open, fluid, and unresisting. But here is where it becomes powerful and uncomfortable. Because if low vibration is contraction, then many of the behaviors you thought were part of your personality may actually be protective patterns. The need to control outcomes, the urge to overthink, the impulse to chase someone when you feel distance, or to withdraw when things start to feel too close. The subtle pressure you place on situations to go a certain way so you can feel okay. None of these are random. They are intelligent responses your system learned at some point in your life. They were created to protect you, to help you navigate uncertainty, rejection, emotional pain, or instability. And they worked, at least at some point. But now, they may be the very mechanisms creating the contraction you are trying to escape. So the question begins to deepen. If what you are experiencing is not a flaw, but a protection, what happens when you stop fighting it? What happens when you become curious instead of corrective? Because the moment you stop labeling your state as wrong, you remove the first layer of resistance. And without that resistance, something inside you begins to soften, to open, to reorganize itself. Not through force, but through understanding. Why is it that the more you want love, the more complicated it sometimes becomes? There is a pattern that quietly plays out in human connection, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Two people meet, and beneath the surface, something deeper than attraction begins to move. One leans in, seeking closeness, reassurance, certainty. The other pulls back, creating space, protecting independence, avoiding emotional overwhelm. And without realizing it, they begin to orbit each other in a dynamic that feels intense, magnetic, and often painful. But this is not random. This is the meeting of two protective systems. One side has learned that love requires holding on, staying close, preventing loss. The other has learned that love can become overwhelming, invasive, or unsafe if it gets too close. One contracts through pursuit, the other contracts through distance, and both, in their own way, are trying to feel safe. What makes this even more powerful is that these patterns often feel like chemistry. The pull, the tension, the emotional highs and lows, it can feel like something meaningful, something rare, something undeniable. But what if part of that intensity is not connection but activation? Because when your system is activated, it does not mean you are aligned. It means something inside you has been triggered. And this is where the illusion begins to dissolve. If both people are operating from protection, then the relationship becomes less about connection and more about regulation. One tries to get closer to feel secure. The other creates distance to feel safe. And the cycle repeats. So the real question is not, why is this happening to me? But something far more revealing. What is this dynamic trying to protect inside me? And what would happen if I no longer needed that protection? What if the strongest position you could ever stand in is not control, not certainty, but neutrality? At first, neutrality can sound almost passive, as if it means not caring, not engaging, or withdrawing from life. But true neutrality is something entirely different. It is not disconnection, it is stability. It is the ability to remain open, aware, and grounded without being pulled into the urgency of needing something to happen in a specific way. And this is where most people feel uncomfortable, because the mind has been conditioned to believe that attachment equals meaning, that if you really care, you must feel urgency, that if something matters, you must hold on to it tightly. But what if that urgency is not love, but fear? Fear of losing, fear of not being chosen, fear of uncertainty. Neutrality dissolves that fear, not by suppressing it, but by no longer organizing your identity around it. When you are neutral, you can observe what is happening without immediately reacting. You can feel emotions without being consumed by them. You can want something without needing it to define your sense of self. And in that space, something subtle but powerful begins to shift. Your energy stops chasing. It stops collapsing into outcomes. It stops trying to control what is outside of you in order to stabilize what is inside. And paradoxically, this is when your field becomes most coherent. Because in quantum terms, coherence is not created through force. It emerges when there is no internal contradiction. When your system is not split between desire and fear, between holding on and bracing for loss. So the question becomes, what would it feel like to want deeply but no longer need? To care without collapsing? To be fully open without trying to control what happens next? Because in that space, you are no longer reacting to life. You are finally meeting it. What if the version of you that you've been trying to fix was never the real you to begin with? This is where the illusion becomes even more subtle. Over time, we begin to build identities around our patterns. I'm anxious. I'm avoidant. I'm the one who overthinks. I'm the one who always pulls away. These labels start as descriptions of behavior, but slowly they become something else. They become who we believe we are. And once something becomes identity, it feels permanent. But what if these patterns were never your essence, only adaptations? Think about it. Every emotional habit, every relational dynamic, every way you learn to respond to love, conflict, or uncertainty, these were shaped by environments, experiences, and moments where your system had to make sense of something overwhelming. You didn't choose them consciously. You developed them intelligently as a way to survive, to belong, to be accepted, or to avoid pain. And they worked. They helped you navigate situations that, at the time, felt too much. But now, those same patterns may be running automatically, long after the original situation is gone. And because they feel familiar, they feel like you. This is the trap. Because you cannot release something you believe you are. But the moment you begin to see that these are patterns, not identity, something opens. There is space between you and the behavior. There is awareness. And with awareness, there is choice. Not forced change. Not self-rejection. But gentle separation. You are not your fear. You are not your attachment style. You are not your emotional reactions. You are the awareness that can observe all of it. And once you begin to experience that distinction, a quiet question starts to emerge. If this is not who I am, then who have I been underneath it all along? What if everything you've been doing to fix your energy has actually been another form of control? This is where the conversation becomes uncomfortable, but also liberating. Because even the most spiritual concepts can be used in ways that keep you stuck. You try to think positive, not because it feels true, but because you believe it will change an outcome. You repeat affirmations, not as an expression of alignment, but as a strategy to be chosen, to be loved, to be validated. You try to stay high vibe, not because you are open, but because you are afraid of what might happen if you aren't. And underneath all of it, there is a subtle message. I need to be a certain way for things to work out. That is not freedom. That is performance. It is control dressed as growth. And control always carries tension. Because when your state becomes a tool to manipulate reality, you are no longer connected to yourself. You are managing yourself. Monitoring every thought. Correcting every emotion, silencing anything that doesn't fit the version of you that you believe is more attractive, more aligned. more likely to get the result you want. But here is the paradox. The more you try to control your internal state, the more contracted your energy becomes. And that contraction is felt, not just by you, but by others. It shows up as pressure, as expectation, as something unspoken, but deeply sensed. People don't respond to the words you say. They respond to the energy behind them. So when your energy carries the weight of choose me, don't leave me, this has to work. It is not experienced as openness. It is experienced as control. And control, no matter how subtle, creates distance. So a deeper question begins to emerge. What would happen if you stopped trying to be right energetically and instead allowed yourself to be real? What if the very thoughts you've been trying to replace are not the problem at all? For years, you may have heard that the key is to think better thoughts. That if you could just shift your mindset, stay positive, and focus on what you want, everything would begin to change. And while intention does matter, there is something deeper that often goes unnoticed. Because what happens when you try to think positively while your body is holding tension, fear, or unresolved emotion? There is a split. On the surface, your mind says, everything is fine. I'm aligned. I trust. But underneath, your nervous system is tight, your chest is heavy, your stomach is uneasy. And that contradiction creates noise in your field. Not because you are doing something wrong, but because you are bypassing what is actually there. This is what makes forced positivity so exhausting. You are not just thinking, you are suppressing. And suppressed emotions do not disappear. They remain active, stored in the body, influencing your perception, your reactions, and even the people you attract. It's why you can think positive all day and still find yourself in the same emotional patterns, the same relationship dynamics, the same cycles that feel impossible to break. Because your system is not responding to your words. It is responding to what is unresolved. In quantum terms, your field is shaped by coherence, not by surface-level intention. And coherence requires honesty. It requires that what you think, what you feel, and what your body holds are not in conflict. So instead of asking, how do I think better? A more powerful doorway opens. What am I feeling that I've been trying not to feel? Because the moment you allow that feeling to exist, without correcting it, without judging it, without trying to escape it, you begin to restore alignment. Not by forcing light, but by removing the resistance that was hiding it. What if the emotions you've been avoiding are actually the doorway to your freedom? Most people are not afraid of failure, rejection, or loss in the way they think. What they are truly afraid of is feeling what those experiences might bring up inside them. The grief, the abandonment,
the shame,
the emptiness, the fear that feels too big, too overwhelming, too unfamiliar to face. So the system adapts. It learns to avoid, to distract, to control, to overthink, to stay busy, to stay positive, to do anything except fully feel. And over time, this becomes automatic. You don't even realize you are avoiding emotion. You just call it managing your life. But here is the hidden cost. Every emotion that is resisted does not disappear. It stays active in the body, waiting. And from that unresolved space, it begins to shape your reality. It influences what you tolerate, what you fear, what you chase, and what you unconsciously recreate. Not because you want to suffer, but because your system is trying to complete what was never fully processed. This is why the same patterns return, not as punishment, but as invitation. Because emotions are not meant to be fixed. They are meant to be felt. And here is the shift that changes everything. An emotion, when fully allowed, does not stay. It moves. It rises, peaks, and dissolves, like a wave that only lingers when it is resisted. The heaviness you fear is not permanent. It is temporary, but only if you stop interrupting it. So the question becomes deeply personal. What have you been unwilling to feel? And what would happen if, just for a moment, you stopped trying to escape it and allowed it to move through you completely? Because on the other side of that feeling, there is space. And in that space, your natural openness begins to return. What if the intensity of your current emotions is not coming from the present moment at all? This is where the layers begin to reveal something deeper. You may believe you are reacting to what is happening right now, a message not answered, a change in someone's behavior, a moment of distance, uncertainty, or tension. And on the surface, that feels true. But have you ever noticed how sometimes the emotional reaction feels disproportionate to the situation? As if something much older has been touched? Because often, what you are feeling is not just about now. It is about then. The nervous system does not separate time the way the mind does. When something in the present resembles a past experience, especially one that carried emotional weight, it activates the same internal response, the same fear, the same longing, the same sense of loss or instability. And suddenly, you're not just responding to a situation. You are reliving a pattern. This is why certain dynamics feel so powerful, so consuming. They are layered. Beneath the present interaction, there may be echoes of earlier experiences, moments where you felt unseen, rejected, abandoned, or not enough. And your system, without conscious awareness, is trying to resolve something that was never fully processed. But here is the key shift. If your reaction is amplified by the past, then the present is not the problem. It is the portal, a doorway into something deeper that is asking to be seen, felt, and released. So instead of asking, "Why is this happening again?" the question becomes more revealing. What is this moment reminding my system of, and what is still unresolved inside me? Because when you begin to see your reactions not as overreactions, but as signals, you stop fighting them, and you start understanding them. And in that understanding, something begins to unwind. What if the way you learn to receive love is still shaping every connection you experience today? Long before you understood relationships, your system was already learning what love feels like, how it is given, and what you must do to receive it. Not through words, but through patterns. Through tone, presence, absence, attention, and emotional availability. As a child, you didn't question these patterns. You adapted to them. If love came with conditions, you learned to perform. If it came with unpredictability, you learned to stay alert. If it felt distant, you learned to chase. If it felt overwhelming, you learned to protect yourself by pulling away. And if it was inconsistent, you learned to hold on tighter just in case it disappeared again. None of this was conscious. It was intelligent, because your system was not trying to understand love. It was trying to survive it. And those adaptations became templates. Templates that now shape how you interpret attention, distance, silence, and connection. Templates that influence who you feel drawn to, what feels familiar, and even what you mistake for chemistry. This is why you can meet someone new and still experience the same emotional patterns. Not because the person is the same, but because the template is. And until that template becomes visible, it continues to operate in the background, quietly influencing your choices, your reactions, and your expectations. But here is where awareness begins to shift everything. If what you learned was adaptation, then it is not fixed. It is not your destiny. It is not who you are. So a deeper question begins to form. What did love feel like in the beginning of your life? And how might that still be shaping what you accept, what you fear, and what you believe you deserve today? Because once you see the template, you are no longer inside it. You can begin to choose differently. What if the pressure you feel in relationships isn't coming from the other person, but from what you are unconsciously asking them to give you? This is one of the most subtle and transformative realizations you can have, because often what we call connection carries hidden expectations. Not always spoken, not always even conscious, but deeply felt. A quiet energy that says, choose me, see me, don't leave me, make me feel secure. And while these desires are human, something changes when they become requirements for your internal stability. They turn into pressure, and pressure is felt, not through words, but through energy. Think about a moment when someone needed something from you, validation, reassurance, attention, but didn't say it directly. You could feel it, couldn't you? That subtle pull, that invisible weight. And instead of feeling closer, you may have felt the urge to step back, to create space, to protect your own autonomy. This is exactly how energy communicates. When your internal state depends on someone else behaving a certain way, your system begins to project that dependency outward. And even if you try to appear calm, grounded, or high vibe, the underlying signal remains. And that signal is not openness. It is control. Not in an aggressive sense, but in a survival sense, a quiet attempt to secure safety through another person. But here is where everything shifts. The moment you begin to meet your own emotional needs internally, the pressure dissolves. The need softens. The urgency fades. And what remains is something entirely different. Presence. Choice. Real connection. So the question becomes deeply clarifying. What am I expecting someone else to give me that I have not yet allowed myself to feel or generate within? Because the moment that expectation releases, so does the weight, and what's left can finally breathe. What if letting go is not losing something, but finally allowing yourself to feel what you've been avoiding? For many people, the idea of letting go feels threatening. It sounds like giving up, like admitting defeat, like accepting that something won't work out. And because of that, the mind resists it. It holds on tighter, tries harder, analyzes more, searches for ways to fix, to change, to regain control. But what if holding on is not strength, but resistance? Because often what you are holding on to is not just a person, a situation, or an outcome. You are holding on to a feeling you don't want to face. The fear of being alone, the sadness of loss, the discomfort of uncertainty, the emptiness that surfaces when something you relied on is no longer there. So instead of feeling those emotions, the system tries to solve them externally, by fixing the situation, by bringing the person back, by restoring what was. But that effort keeps you in a loop because it avoids the very thing that needs to be processed. This is where letting go becomes misunderstood. Letting go is not about the external. It is about your internal willingness to feel, to stop negotiating with reality, to stop postponing emotion, to stop using control as a way to avoid discomfort. And when you allow yourself to feel what is actually there, without rushing it, without softening it, without escaping it, something unexpected happens. The grip loosens, not because you forced yourself to release it, but because there is nothing left to hold. So the question becomes honest and direct. What am I still holding on to because I haven't yet allowed myself to fully feel what it carries? Because on the other side of that feeling, there is space. And in that space, you are free. What if the reason you keep repeating the same patterns is not because you haven't learned the lesson, but because something inside you is still asking to be felt? There is a common belief that life repeats situations to teach you something, as if you failed to understand the message the first time. But what if repetition is not about intellectual understanding at all? What if it's about emotional completion? Because you may already understand your patterns. You may know why you feel anxious, why you pull away, why certain dynamics trigger you. You can explain it, analyze it, even predict it. And yet it still happens.
Why?
Because insight does not dissolve stored emotion. The body does not respond to explanation. It responds to experience. So when something remains unfelt, grief, fear, rejection, abandonment, it does not disappear just because you understand it. It stays active, and your system continues to recreate conditions where that emotion can surface again, not to punish you, but to complete what was interrupted. This is why the same type of relationship can appear in different forms. The same emotional tone, the same tension, the same unresolved feeling, just wearing a different face. And until that emotion is fully allowed, the pattern remains unfinished. But here's the shift that changes everything. You don't need another explanation. You need permission to feel. Because the moment an emotion is fully experienced, without resistance, without avoidance, without trying to control it, it completes its cycle. It no longer needs to return. So the deeper question becomes, what feeling has been repeating in different forms throughout my life that I have never truly allowed myself to experience fully? Because once that emotion is met, the pattern no longer has a reason to exist. And for the first time, something new becomes possible. What if the roles you learn to play are still silently shaping who you believe you need to be? As a child, love was not always something you simply received. It was something you learned to adapt to. You discovered, often without words, what was required to feel safe, accepted, or valued. Maybe you learned that being perfect earned approval, that being quiet avoided conflict, that being helpful created connection, that being strong prevented rejection. And so, you became that version of yourself. Not because it was who you truly were, but because it worked. These roles were intelligent. They helped you navigate environments where emotional needs were not always met directly. They allowed you to belong, to survive, to maintain some form of connection. But over time, something subtle happened. The role became identity. You stopped playing it and started believing it was you. Now, as an adult, you may still feel the pressure to maintain that version of yourself. To perform, to please, to hold everything together, to avoid being too much or not enough. And even when you are alone, that internal expectation remains. But here is the question that begins to loosen everything. What if you are still trying to earn a kind of love that was never meant to be conditional? Because when your sense of worth is tied to a role, your energy contracts. You are no longer expressing, you are managing, monitoring how you appear, how you behave, how you are perceived. And that is not openness. That is survival. So something deeper begins to emerge. If you were not trying to be the right version of yourself, who would you be? What would feel natural, unforced, real? Because the moment you begin to question the role, you create space to step out of it. And in that space, you begin to meet yourself for the first time. What if the authority you've been resisting outside has quietly become the voice controlling you inside? At some point in your life, authority had a shape. It may have been a parent, a teacher, a figure who held power over what was allowed, what was accepted, what was safe. And whether that authority was gentle or harsh, predictable or inconsistent, your system learned how to respond to it. Maybe you learned to comply. Maybe you learned to rebel. Maybe you learned to anticipate, to read the room, to adjust before anything went wrong. But what happens when that external authority is no longer present? Something fascinating begins to occur. The structure doesn't disappear. It internalizes. You may no longer have someone telling you what to do, how to behave, or what is acceptable. But there is still a voice, a quiet pressure, an internal standard that monitors, judges, corrects. A voice that says, you should be better. You shouldn't feel this. You need to fix this. You can't be like this. And suddenly, without realizing it, you become both the authority and the one being controlled. This is where contraction deepens. Because now, the pressure is constant. There is no escape from it, no external boundary. It lives inside you. And in that dynamic, your energy is no longer free to open. It is being regulated by an internalized system of control. But here is where awareness creates a shift. If that voice was learned, then it is not your truth. It is a pattern, a continuation of something that once existed outside of you. So the question begins to unfold. What standards am I holding myself to that were never truly mine? And what would happen if, instead of controlling myself into alignment, I allowed myself into it? Because when internal authority softens, something else emerges. Not chaos, but freedom. And from that freedom, a more authentic form of coherence begins to rise. What if the people who triggered you the most were not powerful because of who they are, but because of what they activated inside you? There are certain individuals who seem to carry a disproportionate impact. Their words linger longer. Their behavior affects you more deeply. Their presence alone can create tension, anxiety, or even a sense of losing control within yourself. And it can feel like they have power over you. But what if that power is not coming from them? What if it is coming from the parts of you that become activated in their presence? Because when someone triggers a strong emotional reaction, it is rarely about the surface interaction. It is about something deeper being touched, something familiar, something unresolved, something that already exists within your system. This is why two people can experience the same situation and respond completely differently. One remains grounded. The other feels overwhelmed, not because the situation changed, but because the internal landscape is different. And this becomes even more revealing when we look at dynamics that feel intense or even toxic. People who are controlling, emotionally distant, or unpredictable often activate deep survival patterns. They mirror back something that your system recognizes, not necessarily as healthy, but as familiar. And familiarity can feel like connection. But here's the shift that transforms everything. If what is being activated is already within you, then the source of the reaction is not external. It is internal, and that means it can be understood, processed, and released. So instead of asking, why do they make me feel this way? A more powerful question begins to open. What part of me is being activated right now? And what is it trying to show me? Because the moment you stop assigning power outward, you begin to reclaim it inward. And in that reclamation, your energy starts to stabilize, not because the world changed, but because you did. What if the behaviors you once labeled as toxic are actually extreme forms of protection? This is where perception begins to soften, not into tolerance, but into understanding. Because when you encounter someone who is controlling, emotionally unavailable, manipulative, or self-centered, it's easy to reduce them to a label. To define them by how they show up, by how they affect you, by the discomfort they create. And while boundaries are essential, something deeper becomes available when you look beyond the behavior itself. Because beneath many of these patterns, there is fear. Not always visible, not always acknowledged, but present. A need to control can come from a fear of losing control. Emotional distance can come from a fear of being overwhelmed. Manipulation can come from a fear of not being enough, as one is. And what appears as confidence or dominance can sometimes be a system that learned, very early on, that vulnerability was unsafe. This does not excuse harmful behavior, but it explains it. And explanation creates space. Because when you begin to see that these behaviors are not expressions of true power, but adaptations rooted in survival, something shifts in how you relate to them. You stop personalizing everything. You stop internalizing their actions as reflections of your worth. And most importantly, you stop trying to change them. Because true power does not come from controlling another person's behavior. It comes from no longer needing them to be different for you to feel stable. So the question becomes clear. Can I see what is behind the behavior without abandoning myself in the process? Because when you can hold both understanding and boundaries, you step out of reaction and into clarity. And in that clarity, your energy no longer gets entangled. It becomes sovereign. What if forgiveness is not about what someone else deserves, but about what you no longer need to carry? For many people, forgiveness feels like agreement, like saying what happened was acceptable, justified, or somehow okay. And because of that, the heart resists it. It holds onto the story, the pain, the memory, believing that releasing it would mean losing something important. But what if holding on is not protecting you but binding you? Because every unresolved experience carries an emotional charge, not just in the mind but in the body, a subtle tension that remains active, influencing how you perceive, how you react, and what you unconsciously expect from others. And over time, that charge begins to shape your reality, not because the past is still happening, but because it is still being carried. Forgiveness, in its deepest sense, is not an external act. It is an internal release. It is the moment you stop reactivating the same emotional loop. The moment you allow the energy tied to that experience to complete, to soften, to dissolve. Not by denying what happened, but by no longer reliving it as if it is still defining you. And this is where something profound shifts. Because when you release the charge, you also release the pattern. You stop seeing through the same lens. You stop expecting the same outcomes. You stop recreating the same dynamics in different forms. Not because the world changed, but because the past no longer occupies your present. So the question becomes deeply personal. What am I still carrying that is no longer mine to hold? And what would it feel like to set it down, not for them, but for myself? Because the moment you release that weight, you don't just feel lighter. You become available for something entirely new. What if the freedom you've been searching for is not something you achieve, but something that remains when resistance ends? This is where everything begins to come together. For so long, the journey may have felt like a path of improvement, becoming better, stronger, more aligned, more evolved. But what if true transformation is not about adding anything to yourself? What if it's about removing what was never yours to carry? Because when you strip away the patterns, the roles, the emotional resistance, the need to control, the fear of feeling, the identity built around survival, what remains is not emptiness. It is clarity. It is openness. It is a natural state that was always there, quietly waiting beneath everything you were taught to hold. And this is where the concept of raising your vibration dissolves completely. Because there is nothing to raise, only something to uncover. In quantum terms, your natural state is coherence, a field where there is no contradiction between what you feel, what you think, and what you allow. And when resistance drops, that coherence emerges on its own, effortlessly. not because you forced alignment, but because you stopped interrupting it. This is why the most profound shifts often feel simple. Not easy, but simple. You stop fighting yourself. You stop correcting your emotions. You stop trying to become someone else. And in that space, something begins to stabilize, not through effort, but through absence of interference. So the question becomes almost quiet. What would remain if I stopped trying to change myself for just a moment? Because in that stillness, without pressure, without performance, you may begin to recognize something familiar, not something new, but something true. And from that truth, everything else begins to reorganize. What if the life you've been trying to create has been waiting for you to become safe within yourself first? This is where the conversation moves from understanding into embodiment, because you can see the patterns. You can recognize the contraction. You can even begin to allow emotions to move. But something deeper still determines how your reality unfolds. Your nervous system, not your thoughts, not your intentions, but what your system feels is safe. Because no matter how much you desire love, expansion, or change, if your system associates those things with uncertainty, loss of control, or emotional risk, it will subtly resist them. Not consciously, not logically, but biologically. And that resistance will not look like fear. It will look like hesitation, like overthinking, like losing interest, like pulling away just when things start to feel real, like finding reasons why something isn't right. Not because it isn't, but because it feels unfamiliar. And unfamiliar, to the nervous system, can feel unsafe. This is why transformation is not about forcing yourself into new experiences. It is about creating internal safety for them. So when you begin to allow your emotions instead of suppressing them, when you stop controlling outcomes to feel secure, when you release the need to perform, to chase, to fix, your system begins to recalibrate. Slowly, gently. It starts to recognize that openness is not dangerous. That connection does not require losing yourself. That uncertainty is not the same as threat. And in that recalibration, your entire field begins to shift. Because now you are no longer trying to attract something different. You are becoming available for it. So the question becomes deeply grounding. Does what I want feel safe for me to receive? Because the moment the answer becomes yes, everything changes. What if the shift you've been waiting for was never about becoming someone new, but about finally allowing yourself to be who you've always been? At the end of all seeking, all effort, all strategies and techniques, something quiet begins to reveal itself. You were never broken. You were never behind. You were never lacking the ability to love, to feel peace, to experience joy, to live in openness. You were simply carrying emotions that were never fully processed, carrying roles that were never truly yours, carrying expectations that were never meant to define you, carrying patterns that once protected you, but no longer serve you. And beneath all of that, there has always been something intact, something undisturbed, something that does not need to be improved, fixed, or elevated, only uncovered. This is the true shift, not the pursuit of a higher state, but the release of everything that obscures your natural one. And when that release begins, not perfectly, not all at once, but gradually, your experience of life changes in a way that feels almost paradoxical. You stop chasing, and things begin to come. You stop forcing, and clarity begins to emerge. You stop performing, and connection becomes real. You stop trying to be high vibration, and suddenly you feel lighter, more open, more present than ever before. Not because you did more, but because you stopped doing what was holding you down. So now, the final question is not something you need to answer with effort. It is something you allow yourself to feel. If nothing is missing, if nothing needs to be added, if your natural state is already whole, what are you ready to release so you can finally return to it? If this message resonated with you, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. Like this video if you felt a shift, and share it with someone who may need to hear this today. And remember, your transformation doesn't begin when you become something new. It begins the moment you stop holding yourself back.